I wasn't supposed to be home until after dark. A meeting across town ended early, and for once traffic cooperated. I remember feeling vaguely grateful for the unexpected free time. Nothing about that drive suggested the day was about to divide itself into a before and an after. When I opened the front door, the house felt occupied but strangely wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, just wrong. I heard voices from the living room. Several people talking with the casual confidence of people who believed they belonged there. Then I noticed my sister wasn't among them. I found her sitting at the edge of the guest room bed. She didn't hear me come in. Her shoulders were shaking. Her eyes were swollen. There were tissues scattered beside her. For a moment, I genuinely thought someone had died. Sarah? She looked up so quickly that it startled both of us. The expression on her face wasn't grief, it was humiliation. The kind that arrives after hours of being cornered. I sat beside her. What happened? She wiped her face and immediately said the words people use when they're trying not to make things worse. It's nothing. I waited. Eventually, she took a slow breath. It's not nothing. The story came out in fragments. Her husband's parents had arrived that afternoon. At first, the conversation had sounded harmless. Questions about finances, questions about future plans, then questions about my house, the house I owned, the house where Sarah had been staying temporarily while navigating a difficult period in her marriage. Somehow the discussion had evolved into assumptions. Assumptions about who might live here permanently, assumptions about future ownership, assumptions about decisions that weren't theirs to make. The worst part wasn't the content, it was the pressure, the repeated suggestions. The insistence that certain arrangements were only logical, the implication that family should be willing to sacrifice for family. Sarah wasn't crying because of one conversation. She was crying because she'd spent hours being treated like an obstacle to somebody else's plan. I asked a simple question: where are they now? She looked toward the living room. I stood and walked there. 3 people sat around my coffee table. Spread across it were folders, printed documents, handwritten notes. One of them was pointing at a page. Another was discussing potential timelines. Nobody noticed me immediately. That probably bothered me more than anything else. They were so comfortable, as if the outcome had already been decided. My arrival interrupted the sentence halfway through. Everyone looked up. A brief silence followed. Then came smiles, explanations. The kind that appear after people realize they've been caught somewhere they shouldn't be. I listened. I let them talk. I asked questions, civil ones, direct ones. Whose documents were those? Why were they discussing property they didn't own? Who had authorized these conversations? The answers became increasingly vague. What struck me most wasn't hostility. It was entitlement. Every explanation rested on the same invisible assumption. If enough pressure was applied, eventually everyone else would cooperate. I could feel anger pushing at the edges of my patience, but anger wasn't useful. Facts were, so I gathered every document from the table. Every page, every note. Then I excused myself and went into my office. For nearly an hour, I reviewed everything: Chich ownership record, Botry documents, Mies Combs. The more I looked, the clearer the situation became. Nobody had broken into my house. Nobody had forged ownership. But they had clearly begun discussing arrangements and expectations that depended entirely on my compliance, and they were doing it before ever speaking to me. That mattered. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had changed slightly. They were waiting, expecting an argument. Instead, I made a phone call. A very ordinary phone call to the attorney who had handled several family property matters over the years. He answered. I explained the situation. He asked a few questions. Then he said something simple. Put me on speaker. I did. The conversation that followed lasted less than 10 minutes. No threats, no raised voices. Just clarity. He explained ownership rights, limitations, legal boundaries. Most importantly, he explained that discussions about future occupancy or control meant absolutely nothing without the consent of the actual owner. The shift was immediate, not dramatic, just unmistakable. For the first time all afternoon, nobody was speaking in assumptions, because assumptions had been replaced by facts. One of them attempted to reframe everything as a misunderstanding. Maybe parts of it were, maybe parts weren't. At that point, it didn't matter. The discussion was over. The attorney's final recommendation was straightforward. Any future proposal should be made directly, formally, and with complete transparency, not through pressure, not through emotional leverage, not through private conversations designed to create momentum before the relevant person even knew they were happening. After the call ended, the room became very quiet. The confidence I'd walked into earlier was gone. Nobody had been publicly humiliated. Nobody had been destroyed. Reality had simply entered the conversation, and reality wasn't on their side. Within 30 minutes, they gathered their papers and left. The front door closed behind them. The house felt different immediately. Lighter, not victorious, just lighter. I found Sarah sitting in the kitchen afterward. She looked exhausted. We talked for a long time, not about property, not about legal boundaries, about trust, about how easily people can start treating someone else's kindness like a resource to be managed. At one point, she asked why I'd stayed so calm. The truth was that I hadn't felt calm at all. I had been furious, but fury would have turned the day into a fight. Facts turned it into a conclusion. Months later, some relationships remained strained. A few conversations never fully recovered. That's the part people rarely mention. Exposure doesn't automatically create healing. Sometimes it simply removes confusion, but one thing changed permanently. My sister stopped apologizing for protecting herself, and I stopped assuming that loyalty always looks gentle. Sometimes loyalty is walking into a room, recognizing that someone you love has been cornered, and refusing to let silence do the rest of the damage. There was no celebration afterward, no grand speech, no perfect ending, just a house that remained ours to decide about, and a sister who finally understood she didn't have to face people like that alone.